This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. My guest today is Katherine Jellison, a PhD, chairman of the History Department at Ohio University. And I've known Katherine for, 20 years or so, I guess.
I guess I came here in 93, so
In 93.
24 years.
Yeah, a little bit longer than we thought even, yes. So Katherine is a specialist on women's history. And I know you wrote a very interesting PhD thesis on something that most women are quite interested in. The White Wedding?
Oh, yeah. That wasn't my dissertation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, my dissertation was, which was my first book then, in revised form, was about farm women and technology.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that book. It came out the very month I moved here and started work in September of 1993. So that was a bit before you and I got to know each other. And then my second book was about the White Wedding. Yeah, about the history of it since World War II.
Yes, and but wasn't it Queen Victoria herself who
That's right.
popularized
That's right. Queen Victoria in the 19th century and her marriage to Prince Albert popularized the white wedding dress and the idea of having multiple attendants around a person when she marries, and the multi-tiered cake. She was the person who popularized all of those conventions that we now just automatically associate with weddings.
Yes.
But it wasn't until after World War II that this became, as I argue in that book, democratized, and people all up and down the socioeconomic scale have access to the accoutrement of the White Wedding. It was initially an upper class ritual. People, well, not everyone, of course, is as upper class as Queen Victoria,
Yes.
but it was primarily people of the urban middle class in England, Western Europe, and here in the U.S. until after World War II.
Did you personally have a white wedding?
Well, I had. I call it an off-white wedding, I guess.
Oh,
I had sort of a cream-colored dress, and we did have a multi-tier cake, but it was just our family members there. And
Yes.
I had one attendant, my sister, and my husband had his nephew, who's basically our same age. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but my husband was born 24 years after his oldest brother,
Oh, my
and
goodness.
21 or 22 years after his sister, and 14 years after the so-called middle brother, and then there was David. So through most of our marriage, when we've talked about nieces and nephews, we've been talking about people who are our age peers.
Oh, yes.
The children of his two oldest siblings, and so it was his sister's son who was the best man, who's actually he's an English professor at Ohio Valley University in Parkersburg.
Oh, really?
So he's nearby now. Yeah.
He's nearby.
Yeah,
Get
yeah.
to see him
Yes,
occasionally.
yes, saw him a couple times this summer.
Right. Well, I didn't have a white wedding dress either, but I had a new dress, bought for the occasion. It was sort of a pinkish thing made of Egyptian cotton.
Sounds pretty.
And it was pinkish because it was one of those fabrics that is pink and gray or something woven together.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
kind of. So it's an off shade, but interesting. And the thing I really liked about it was that it had a little French ribbon, thing underneath the bosom. Little tie.
Oh yeah. So that was what, the mid 1950s?
Yes, we were married July 2nd, 1954.
Okay.
In Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Were you in grad school then?
Yes.
That's what I thought.
That's where Bob and I met, was in grad school. And his parents were able to come because they lived on the East Coast.
Okay.
So it was a possible drive for them, But
were your parents still in Nevada
yes,
at that time? Okay.
Yes, my parents were in Nevada, and so my mother sent me a a hat for the wedding. Of course, people were still wearing
Right,
hats in
right.
the 50s. Women were still wearing hats. Well, for that, men were wearing hats too, fedoras mostly.
Right. I watched some of that Katherine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy movie last night,
Oh, yes.
Adam's Rib,
Yes.
and everyone, men and women, were all wearing hats.
Oh,
yeah.
The good old days or the bad old days, as the case may
Yeah.
be.
Some good and some bad.
Right. Well, it's, but as you point out, it's become very traditional in our country for the past 60, 70 years now.
Yeah. As I referred to it, this is not my original term. Other scholars had used it before me, but an invented tradition.
Yes.
And for instance, when Queen Victoria wore the white dress, it was just, she liked how it looked. It wasn't necessarily symbolizing anything. But since she, was a style leader, we think of the older Queen Elizabeth Queen Victoria, when she was overweight and very matronly. But as a younger woman, she was considered quite a style leader.
Yeah.
And she just liked the white dress. Well, after the fact, as this became more popular, that's when people started putting the various meanings on the white dress, that it was supposed to symbolize the bride's virginity and that kind of thing. That was all imposed after the fact.
Afterwards.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, and I thought it would be interesting, since we're both, so to speak, historians, to talk a little bit about our backgrounds in history.
Sure.
And I myself consider I had a pretty good, thorough background in history for several reasons. One being that during my high school years, my mother was intent on me finishing high school in 3 years.
Oh.
So she signed me up for a world history course.
Oh, really?
By,
correspondence?
Correspondence
Oh, okay.
with the University of California
Oh.
in Berkeley. And I remember that, sort of hanging over my head like the sword of Damocles.
Yeah. I've got to finish this course. I've got to do my lessons.
Yeah, I've got to do this chapter. I've got to get the test and go to the school office and take the test, and that sort of thing.
Right.
But that did give me a good background. And then when I went to Stanford, every freshman had to take history of Western civilization.
Okay.
And I was a freshman in 1948.
Okay.
So along with about 1,000 other people, we were all taking Western Civ, which was a very good course and interesting. And I was asked to be in a small seminar group. But the only problem with that was that I got in a small seminar group, and I thought, oh, here are these kids who've been to Europe and so forth and so on, and I'm only 16. And I began to feel sort of, the feeling that you're not quite up to it. But it was a very good course. And they began with the ancients.
Okay.
Yeah. We had Assyrians and Persians and Egyptians.
Right.
The first quarter.
Yeah.
And then, and I think also the Greeks and Romans, for that matter, and then sort of history from the end of Rome to more or less modern times, like about 1700. So it was a 3-quarter course.
Okay. Yeah, I took Western Civ also as a first-year college student, but this was in Kansas. We were on the semester system, so and I'd actually tested out of the basic history courses, but because I was a history major, I still had to. They still required me to take both halves of Western Civ, and I think our breaking point was probably around 1700. So we take the first half in the fall semester and the second half in the spring semester. And we also, if you're a history major, had to take both halves of U.S. history. Yeah.
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 Right. Well, and I was a history major eventually myself, so I had actually a kind of a checkered background. I remember taking the medieval course, for instance, medieval Europe course, which was definitely not sort of in my lineup of courses. But and then I took my seminars, my senior seminars, in Far East.
Oh, okay.
But in the meantime, I'd had a lot of U.S. history and so on. And in fact, it was in one of the U.S. history courses that I was taking that I met another historian who taught for many years at Ohio State University named John Burnham. I don't know if you've ever met him.
The name does sound familiar.
Well, he wrote on sort of social issues and psychology and ideology and so forth. He just very recently passed away, but he was at Ohio State he was already at Ohio State when Bob and I came to Athens in 1964. He'd been teaching at OSU a long time, so I had some special friends, you know, who were in history as well as marrying a historian, which means a lot of
a lot of discussion of history at the dinner table. Now, did you take political science classes too?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, I got a degree at OU in what we called government in those days.
Right.
But it was basically, you know, the same thing as political science. And then I have also masters in social science.
Okay.
So
that's right.
My history BA is really my you know, big academic background in history. But it's very interesting, you know.
I agree. I've dedicated my life to it.
Why do you think you first became interested in history?
Well, as I think you know, I grew up in western Kansas, and I always specify specifically western Kansas because it's a part of the state that probably has more of the characteristics of the far west than the Midwest. It's that I grew up in the High Plains region, you know, that semi-arid environment, sparsely populated part of the state. And it seemed to me, growing up anyway, that the 19th century history was still very immediate. And I was born in 1960, but my father and his father-in-law, my maternal grandfather, talked a lot about, speaking of dinner table, you know, around the dinner table, you know, holiday table, sitting around Thanksgiving table, or, you know, going off on a fishing trip and I'd be in the back seat. They talked a lot about Kansas history and about the history of the 19th century, the Indian Wars period, and also the homesteading period, which for both of them, I talked before about my husband being a late in life baby for his mother. My dad and my dad's twin sister were late in life babies for my paternal grandmother. And so my dad and his twin sister were the youngest of 10 children, born when his mom was in her 40s. And so both my father's parents and my maternal grandfather's parents were peers. So, you know, my dad was basically 2 generations younger than his parents because he'd been born so late in their lives. And so, so my grandfather, my maternal grandfather's parents had known my dad's parents. They had all grown up in the same part of Kansas, more central Kansas. And so they knew those homesteading stories particularly really well because my dad had heard those stories from his parents and my grandfather from his parents, and they would talk about those things a lot. And so I think I just happened to be in a family that talked a lot about the state and local history around us. And usually when we would go on any kind of family vacation, we would stop at historical places. I remember the summer I was 6, we went to Springfield, Illinois, and saw all the Lincoln stuff. And I really, I remember being so taken with that as a 6-year-old. Of course, all those museums have been redone there in Springfield, but at that time, it was kind of the more old-fashioned museum. The current Lincoln Museum in Springfield is very high-tech. I don't know if you've been there, but it has all the bells and whistles. This was old-fashioned, you know, you just walk by the exhibits, nothing terribly interactive. But for a little kid, one of the things that fascinated me were these little shadow boxes. And for children, you'd step up on some steps and look in, and there were recreations of scenes in Lincoln's life. And that probably struck me as being sort of like dolls, you know, to see the little figures in there, kind of like a dollhouse. And there were scenes, for instance, as I remember it, him, you know, as a boy reading in front of the fireplace in the cabin, and then probably there was a scene of him, you know, getting married to Mary Todd, and these kind of little miniature scenes that really captured my imagination.
And were just right for a 6-year-old.
Exactly,
yes,
exactly.
That's important.
And so I think that being my first trip east of Kansas, my dad was actually one of these things. My dad was off to a meeting in Indiana, and the whole family went along and did tourist things on the way. We stopped by the Arch in St. Louis, which was brand new then. That's the year it opened. And did the Lincoln things in Springfield, Illinois. And that all just really, really captured my imagination. It was probably that summer, the summer I was 6, that I really started being quite interested in history.
Yeah. Well, I remember the 3rd grade reader. I've mentioned this several times before, I know, on the air. But the very last part of it had stories from the past, you know, kind of thing. And the first one was about the Revolution.
Okay.
And the last one was about World War I.
Okay.
And to me, you know, hey, it's a long time in the past and maybe about at the same time, you know. I had no concept of the, you know, 125 years
It was
or
all
whatever.
in the past, yeah.
Between the American Revolution and World War I. But later I became more interested in, hey, what happened in between those times. So that is an important part of getting interested in history when you're young. I think it's pretty important. Well, I think that we might talk a little bit about the fact that we went last Monday night, it's a week ago yesterday, to the United Campus Ministry meeting that was held as sort of, you know, instantaneously, shall we say.
Yes.
It was set up instantaneously because of this incident with the Nazi flag, or party flag, as it was put on the front page of the Athens News. Nazi flag or party flag, and of course the picture is a red flag with a laurel wreath and an eagle in flagrante, so to speak, with his wings outspread, and SPQR underneath, which I recognize from my days in taking Latin as being definitely a Roman, a Roman thing. Now, one of the things that's not shown on this flag, and which the party flag thing kind of made a difference, and then when they had this headline, charges that it's racist or fascist, the Roman flag had, the eagle had in its claws a fasces, a bundle of sticks with an axe head on it, which was a symbol of ancient Rome, and was the Mussolini's Roman, his effort, part of his effort to be Roman, revive Roman history and Roman greatness for the Italians.
Exactly. Yeah.
When he founded the Fascist Party back in 1922. And then, of course, he was the first of the so-called fascist groups. But the Nazis came along in 1933, and they really took center stage, obviously. But so that's why they say Nazi flag. And apparently flags like this have been used recently by the white supremacists.
Right. And I think people became aware of this in the incident in Charlottesville, Virginia, over the summer, in the late summer, when white supremacists marched in Charlottesville and carried various flags and signs and torches. And this particular image that Lois is talking about, and that this front page story was about in the Athens News, this particular flag struck some observers as being very similar to the flags that were carried in Charlottesville by white supremacists. And I would say at a glance, there is a striking similarity. I don't know how many people would notice the presence or absence of the fasces. So this flag had become controversial. People had started posting pictures of it on social media, and this flag was hung at an apartment where some male undergraduates at Ohio University live. And so the discussion that Lois and I participated in a week and a day ago was a discussion about the flag, free speech, where the proper boundaries were, and it was largely community people, but 3 of the 4 young men at this residence showed up as well. And Lois actually called me the next morning to talk about various things, but I think the first thing you said to me was, well, that was an interesting discussion last night. And it certainly was. And then subsequently, both you and I had letters to the editor about it. Although I think your letter also referenced the sort of backwards or lopsided swastika that was. Did you make reference to that in your letter?
Well, I'm can't remember. I just read the letter. As a matter of fact, it's in today's Athens News.
Yes, right. I saw
Whereas
your letter.
yours was in Thursday's Athens News.
Right.
And you brought up the importance of symbols and how symbols change over time.
Right, and how their meanings can change, and how a symbol that was initially intended to mean one thing by the people who created and used it could be used later for different purposes. And so this image of the eagle standing in the laurel wreath against the red background, was used in the Roman Republic for one purpose, by Mussolini for a different purpose, and now has shown up in various form and fashion in marches like the one in Charlottesville that were proclaiming white supremacy. Now, the young men that we spoke with last week said that that was not their intent, but certainly many people have looked at the flag and what's the best word to say, felt uneasy about it or queasy about it, recognizing its similarity, particularly to fascist Italy and its symbolism.
And the connection with the Nazis. I remember that young lady who was crying,
right.
Because her parents or grandparents were victims of the Holocaust, and there were several Jewish girls there. As a matter of fact, one of the very interesting things about the meeting was that it was almost all women.
Yes, I think you did mention that in your letter.
Right.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because lately it seems any time that I'm in a group like that talking about community or political issues, it is primarily women. And you referenced this organization Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURGE, and I'm a member of the core organizing group for that organization here in town, and that is also predominantly female. And in fact, there has been discussion among some of us, oh, we need to get more men involved. But yeah, that was definitely a predominantly female group of
there.
discussants the
Yeah.
other night.
At,
I was going to say audience. We were both the performers and the audience.
That's right.
Group discussion. Yeah.
All the folks who were there.
Yeah.
And speaking of the difference in symbols, that same page shows a backwards swastika with Clinton's name on it.
Yeah, and I don't quite
For whatever
understand that.
reason,
Yeah.
yeah.
I wasn't understanding whoever spray painted that, what they were trying to get across
What-
there.
what's the meaning?
Yeah.
But one of the very interesting things about the swastika is that it's a traditional symbol before the Nazis took it on. It was a traditional symbol of peace and brotherhood from India, I believe.
And there, and actually, I mean, I'm no expert on this, but there has, not only in India, but in other parts of the world too, what we today would predominantly characterize as the Nazi swastika, right? Because
Right.
that's where this symbol really became widely known. That there are other places in the world where that kind of design or symbol has been used, and I know in Native America it was used. If you go to the Kennedy Museum and look at some of the weavings there, you will see a similar symbol. And before we started recording our conversation here, Lois and I were talking about First Ladies and the history of First Ladies.
Yes.
There's, I wrote a chapter about Jackie Kennedy for a collection that came out, I think, last year. About, there's a chapter in this collection on each of the First Ladies, and I was assigned the chapter about Jackie Kennedy, and there's a picture of her in the 1930s as a youngster. And we all remember what a horsewoman she was.
Oh, yes.
And so a lot of her childhood pictures are taken, with horses.
Yeah.
And this was one where she was dressed as a Native American girl and standing with the horse. And she has on the front of her dress
big swastika.
Yes, a big swastika. So ironically, the future
Right.
First Lady wearing a swastika, but in the 1930s in the U.S.,
It was still...
it was still just an innocent symbol.
Well, and I noticed when I went over to Washington County one time,
Oh yeah, on the floor in the courthouse.
the courthouse
Yes,
floor
yes,
has, which
that's right.
was probably built about 1880 or something like
Probably.
that. Surely in the 19th century, and it has swastikas in the tile floor.
That's right.
Which were, like I say, a symbol of brotherhood or something at the time. So symbols can change,
Yes.
that's for sure.
Yes, and so my letter as a history educator was basically saying before we go out there and start displaying certain symbols, maybe we better know more about their history.
Yes.
For
better or worse.
For better or worse, yes.
As it may be.
Yes.
Well, I also wanted to talk some about the fact that this is still 2017.
Yes, it is. A couple more
For
months.
a couple more months, and it's the 40th anniversary year of the International Women's Year meetings. I've brought a couple of my books, which I have shown before, this To Form a More Perfect Union. These are very battered books,
I see that.
as you can tell,
And
because it
very-
is 40 years
Right,
old.
and what am I trying to say?
It has the women's bird on it.
So the symbol with the women's bird on it, and the typeface is all very 1970s to me.
Yes.
You know, it has just the look of 70s iconography in the typeface. You can tell it's a primary document from that decade.
Yes, and it was came out in '76.
So it's red, white, and blue, too. Everything, remember, in 1976 was red, white, and blue.
1976 was a really big year. It was the bicentennial of the start of, of the independence, Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. Hardly a man is now alive
that remembers that famous day
and year. To quote Henry Wadsworth Longfellow,
That's right.
He was my favorite poet when I was a girl long ago. But this came out in '76 because it followed the Mexico City International Women's Year event. That was a United Nations event.
Was that 75?
It was in '75 in Mexico City. And they were promoting having every country celebrate women. They were starting a decade for women beginning in '75. And so in '76, the State Department put out this to form a more perfect union. And they got some money, which was hard fought for, to have state meetings, $5 million. And interestingly enough, one of the prime opponents of the whole thing was our congressman, Clarence Miller.
That was before my time as an
Right,
Ohioan.
that's before your time. But he was our congressman for many years, and he was very much opposed to spending federal money. That was part of it. However, he was also against it because people were afraid of these national women's meetings, you know, and they're going to talk about controversial subjects, and we have this whole idea of divided we stand, you know. In a sense, they think that first became really emphasized in the 1970s. And it shows up at the top here, the women in blue, light blue, and divided we stand. These are the liberals who went to the Houston meeting, the final, after they had meetings in 56 states and territories. Then they went to Houston in November of 1977 for a national meeting. And I believe you met this
the woman in the center accidentally. In 2004. She looked just the same. So this is 1977. Her name's Peggy Kokernot, and when last I knew, she still lived in Columbus, Ohio. Her hair was shorter. It was more sort of chin length. But I looked across the room. This was maybe in Denver. Denver, Colorado. I was coming from Portland, Oregon, and changed planes in Denver. And, you know, I was waiting there at my gate and looked across the room, and I saw the woman from this famous photograph. And I thought, oh, is that the woman carrying the Freedom Torch? You see in the photo, the three young women in the middle are holding a torch. And it is a torch that had been carried across country down to Houston from Seneca Falls, New York, which was where the first women's rights meeting was held in 1848. So these three women who were all runners and it was, as you see, a diverse group, a Latina, a Caucasian woman, and an African-American woman. And I know this photograph very well. To the left of the Latina is a famous congresswoman, Bella Abzug from the state of New York. And Betty Friedan is to the right of the African-American woman. the author of The Feminine Mystique and the first president of the National Organization for Women. Anyway, so I knew this photograph very well, looked across the room there waiting for my plane, and I thought, that looks like the woman from that famous photograph, 1977 in Houston, Texas. But her hair's shorter. But no, that was many years ago. That can't possibly be the same woman.
Some people keep their...
Oh, yeah. Look. Well, I found out how she does it, too. Oh. So we got on the plane. It turns out the woman was sitting next to me. Uh-huh. And this was, as I said, 2004, and it was a presidential election year. And we started talking about politics. And we talked, she said she'd ridden a mountain bike up a mountain in Idaho that morning. So wow. she keeps very physically fit.
Yeah.
And I think she said her mother lived in Idaho and she'd been visiting her. And yeah, so we were talking about this and politics and, physical fitness. And she said, I used to be a marathon runner. And she said she had been one of the people who was involved in the movement for the women's marathon to be part of the Olympics. Ah. And so we're talking some more, and I'm putting this all together. Okay, she's politically active, she's very physically fit, she was a marathoner, and she said, oh, and I used to be very involved in the women's movement. And I turned to her, she's my seatmate, I said, and you were at the 1977 women's meeting in Houston, Texas. She said, yes, how did you know that? I said, you're famous. Your picture is everywhere. And she didn't realize how widely reproduced this
picture is.
It's on the cover of many books. So that's then when we exchanged information. She said that she'd moved from being an activist so much for human rights and women's rights specifically into animal rights. And so on the occasion I met her back in the fall of 2004, that's where her energy was going to animal rights. And she was spending a lot of time in the State House in Columbus lobbying on behalf of animal rights. And I think if you notice, you can get those specialized license plates now that reference animal rights, and that was what she was working on then, that you could buy these special license plates for your car, and then the proceeds would go to animal rights causes. Yes. So that's what she was working on then. And so what a small world. And of course, inevitably it was late by the time we all got to Columbus, and I still had to come on to Athens. So I didn't stay up and write any emails that night, but the next morning, as soon as I got on email, I was writing all my women's history friends, and the title of my email, in the subject line was, I met a celebrity last night. Yes. Yeah, so Peggy Kokernut is the woman there in the middle of that photograph.
Herself.
Yes.
Well, but it is Divided We Stand, and it's interesting, the subtitle, The Battle Over Women's Rights and Family Values That Polarized American Politics. Well, of course, I think that most of us women's rights people would say we are also in favor of family values.
Right.
But this family values is more like the traditional family with the husband in charge kind of family.
The traditional patriarchal family.
Patriarchal family is what they're talking about, family values. And so that's why they show on the bottom the Stop ERA, symbols with the late Phyllis Schlafly back in the old days. Because in 1977, when they had the meeting in Houston for the International Women's Year event in November, the opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment were also there.
That's right.
Across the city, where there were 20,000 women's rights people here, and there were 20,000 family values rights people there, in the same city at that time. Must have been a very interesting week.
It must have been.
Well, anyway, I brought this picture to show to show, and we'll see it. This looks like a bunch of people, mostly women, and it is a bunch of people, mostly women. Actually, these are the courthouse steps in Athens, Ohio, and here am I up near the top there.
With a microphone.
With the microphone, standing on this sort of step-like thing that they have next to these outside steps into the courthouse, addressing the crowd. Now, this crowd was gathered on July 1st, 1982. It was the day after the expiration of the Equal Rights Amendment. And we called a meeting for a new era for women. Because the Equal Rights Amendment had not been passed by enough people. And that was an interesting event of the 1970s. I remember quite well that Ohio was one of the very last states to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. It was in 1984. And at that point, something like 33 states had ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. And then there came a, halt. There were certain states, most of them in the South, but not entirely.
Yeah, it was primarily in the South. The only northern industrial state that did not approve the ERA was Phyllis Schlafly's home state of Illinois. Because she was really well organized and well financed there in her anti-ERA campaign. And then the what we, I guess, would call the predominantly Mormon state of Utah and nearby states of, I'm trying to think, Arizona and Nevada.
Also,
yeah, that's right. So, which also have significant Mormon populations, Nevada and Arizona, and that was because the Mormon Church very strongly opposed the Equal Rights Amendment.
So it was actually an interesting day, because after this picture was taken, and at least once or twice a pickup truck roared down the street in front, and I kind of wondered, of course they do that anyway, but maybe they were making, there were a couple of men in the cab, perhaps they were making a statement.
Put my glasses on and get in, look a little. So,
I don't think it shows one of those.
There is a pickup. Well, there's a pickup and there's one, but they're parked.
But we were thrown out of the courthouse steps by the sheriff, and it was not, that he had anything particular against us, but they had some incidents in the courthouse that week of fires being set in wastebaskets.
Oh, really?
Yeah, crazy stuff. And as a matter of fact, Claire Ball Sr. was on trial in the courthouse for having someone who was an employee of the townships, and Claire Ball Sr. was a township trustee. Because he'd had this fellow who was an employee of the trustees do some personal work at his home, that kind of thing. So we never knew exactly what it was, but the sheriff said, you've got to stop because we're having problems here. And so we had to go across the street, and we had lined up like 10 women to speak, and 4 of them had spoken, including the county commissioner, Karen Harvey, who was county commissioner at the time.
I know Karen.
And when this happened, and Helen Horn saved the day. She said, "On to College Green." So some of us, anyway, we couldn't take the microphone with us or anything. But in fact, that was lent to us by WATH, because the man at WATH's wife was quite active with this group at the time, back in 1982. And we went down to College Green to the War Memorial.
Oh,
And
yeah.
finished up there, but there wasn't. There were, you know.
But you didn't have a microphone
No
anymore.
microphone. This is how you put the women down. You know, make them stop talking.
Right.
Or if they're
right,
talking,
right.
make sure that they're not heard.
They're not heard.
Not
I'm looking
heard.
at the signs here. Failure is impossible,
Right.
which was a Susan B. Anthony
Yes.
slogan about women's suffrage. Do you remember who the little kid is holding that sign?
No, it must be one of the a parent is in the group. A woman who is the mother would be in the group. These are almost all women here in the picture.
It looks like this might be a male reporter sitting
Yes,
there. It
that
looks like he's
could-
taking notes.
Yeah, that could be very well, because it was.
And then, of course, an organization that Lois is a life member of, the League of Women
Yes.
Voters. The sign is, Lois and I are both members, but Lois has been a member for many decades and was
Right.
one of the first recipients of the Spirit Award from our local
League of
chapter
Women
of the League of
Voters.
Women Voters.
Yes. I'm not sure. It might have even been my sign. It's sort of, since I'm the person at the
Yeah. Right.
microphone.
Well, I see some other signs, but I can't read what they all say there.
Yeah.
A little far back.
But
It's a great
anyway,
picture.
it's an interesting picture, and my friend Judy Daso, who used to be at the library, OU library, had this made up for me. You know, it's got a nice
Very
silver
nice.
frame
yes,
and
it
everything.
is nicely framed.
Yeah.
Is that Pat G here, maybe?
It probably is Pat G, because she was still here at the time.
Yeah, and very
And-
active always in the League of Women Voters.
Right, she was, and they moved to Georgia. Her husband was the big, what do they call it? You know, it's not the traditional wrestling, but the specialized wrestling
what?
where you wear a black band.
Oh, sumo wrestling?
Well, I thought it was called something
Oh,
else. but
Greco-Roman wrestling? I don't know kinds of wrestling.
I can't remember, unfortunately,
Huh.
getting to that age.
No, I never knew her husband. I only knew her. And as I was telling Lois before we were on camera, I'm sure I would know many of the people in the photograph, although they would probably look different today, wearing different clothes and hairstyles, and probably some difference in hair color.
Right.
But
Since it was
I can't make out many
1982,
faces here. Yeah.
1982,
Well,
which
it's
is
35
years
years ago. Oh,
yeah, my goodness. Time flies
It
by,
does,
that's
it
for
does.
sure.
But that corner looks so much the same.
Oh, yes.
And it's still the place where people gather to let their political thoughts be known, and then, of course, across the street there, the Presbyterian Church.
Yes.
All looks very familiar.
Yes. Well, and as I said, these items came from 1976. This was published to form a more perfect union, justice for American women. And it had the things listed that we needed to, in the state meetings, take up. And I was one of the members of the committee in Ohio that organized the Ohio meeting, which was held in Columbus, June 11th and 12th. There I am, Lois Whaley Athens, along with all the other
From all over the state, yeah.
good people from all over the state. Shirley Timoneri, I think, was the person who put this together after the meeting.
Okay.
In 77 in Columbus at the fairgrounds. But it's a report on we had like 45 different workshops on different topics of interest to women and so on. And that was all written up and published in this Worlds of Ohio Women. It was called WOW, you know.
Oh, I get it.
W-O-W.
Okay.
Worlds of Ohio Women was our meeting in 1977. And I know that they sent a copy to every library in Ohio. I'm not sure how many of them still have it around, because that's my own personal
Yeah.
copy. But
Well, it looks like it was done on a typewriter. I mean, this is,
yeah, well, it's
pre-computers.
pre-computers.
Yeah.
Yes.
And several symbols. Again, the women and bird symbol within the state of Ohio is that central image. And then
Yes.
there's Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Yes.
But I can't tell who all the other people are supposed to be.
Yeah, that's my own problem as well.
Yeah. Interesting.
But it was an interesting meeting, and it was part of this Divided We Stand. The meeting was, like I say, June 11th and 12th, and on June 11th, a lot of right-wingers came in, especially were bussed in, because they were electing delegates to go to Houston
Oh, right.
on the first day of the event. And so there were, most of the people who were elected were right-wingers, the family values people.
Elected from Ohio?
From Ohio.
Ah, okay.
But Ohio, interestingly, was one of the few states where that was the case, where it was a majority of the women who went were the more conservative ones. There were some in the group who went. The local president of NOW at the time she was also on the state committee, because she was an OU person who worked in publicity. And she's been long gone, from these parts. Her name is Susan Price. She was Susan Kreitz Price, and she lives in Washington, D.C. now.
Okay.
I haven't seen her in a long time, as it turns out, but when I used to go to D.C., I used to give her a call and see how things were going. But she was among the Ohioans who did go to the national meeting in Houston in November of '77. So it was an interesting event, and one of the first things I did when the thing was over, and we saw what happened, was I immediately wrote a long memo, which I sent to neighboring states which hadn't had their meetings yet, saying, for heaven's sakes, emphasize that this is not the sort of meeting where you just want the presidents of groups to come. You want people to come to vote, people to vote, and to vote for delegates who will stand up for women's rights. And so that was a part, actually. I wrote a paper for you.
I remember that.
10 years ago about that event.
And I remember you were showing me all the various documents that you had saved.
Yeah.
And how the Phyllis Schlafly forces had conflated their anti-ERA campaign with so many other issues that were very concerning to the right at that time, such as giving the Panama Canal back to Panama. I remember it was like a menu of right-wing issues, all somehow bound up with family values.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. It is. It was an interesting event for sure, and like I say, I did get that memo out, and then hopefully maybe made a little bit of help for those places near us that hadn't yet had their meetings.
Right.
But as it turned out, happily, I thought very happily, it turned out that most of the state meeting delegations were more women's rights than, quote, family values, patriarchal type family values.
Yeah.
Well, those issues have certainly not gone away.
Boy, that is for sure.
Yeah, I mean, this book by Marjorie Spruill, Divided We Stand, this is a brand new book. Just came out in the spring, and she did a wonderful job of documenting a lot of the places, although she didn't have much of anything about Ohio, as it turned out in it. She documented a lot on the right, which was, you know, something I hadn't known at all much about, except that I knew Phyllis Schlafly was involved. So anyway, it's been an interesting day talking.
Yes.
And we're just about done. And is there anything further you'd like to say?
No, we've covered a lot of issues, but all issues that are important, and some of them have been long-time issues, as you said, this idea of this cultural divide in the U.S. that we're still dealing with.
Yes.
I think you're right. We see its origins in its current fashion in the 1970s. And this is a great cover on the Sproul book. And as Lois knows, I was hoping to hear Marjorie Sproul speak at a conference in England back in April. She was the keynote speaker for a conference at the British Association of American Studies. But I got off the plane sick, and all I ended up doing was going to the conference the day of my session. I was finally well enough, which is good, to get up and read my own paper, but I missed her keynote address. And that was that would have been right as this book was coming out. So I haven't read the book yet. I've read some of the reviews.
Yeah, there's a very good review in the current New York Review of Books.
Yes, that's what you said
in
a voicemail message you left for me.
Let me just mention too that I'm wearing my Elizabeth Warren T-shirt. Remember, nevertheless, she persisted. And that was last winter, I think it was, when she was reading a letter from Coretta Scott King, and Mitch McConnell said, "Oh, you can't do that now," you know, and so on. And he stopped her.
That's right.
From speaking. I've never seen anything like that.
Well, it is so similar to the situation you just talked about in this photograph.
Right.
You know, silencing women, and she persisted. Echoes of Susan B. Anthony, failure is impossible.
Yeah. She went out to the Senate corridor and talked to the press.
Right.
And she probably got more press that way.
Oh, yes, I think so. I think so. And this slogan has become very popular.
Yes. She persisted.
Yes.
Well, this is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. And thanks very much, Katherine Jellison.
Thank you for inviting me. This has been fun.